The dusty afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains in my living room, illuminating motes dancing in the air like tiny forgotten ghosts. They looked beautiful, ethereal, and entirely out of place in the heavy quiet that had settled over the house since, well, since everything changed. My hands rested in my lap, gnarled and worn, tracing the faded pattern on the armchair I'd inherited from my own grandmother. This house, this chair, the air I breathed within these walls, it all felt imbued with the weight of generations, of hopes placed, and often, heartbreakingly, it was meant to be a sanctuary, a continuation, a place where the threads of family history could be woven into a stronger, brighter tapestry. Instead, it felt like a battleground, quiet now, but scarred. I thought about the baby. Little Lily, her name itself felt like a fragile, precious bloom in the harsh landscape of the past few months. Lily, with her impossibly small fingers that would grip my thumb like a lifeline, her wide, curious eyes that held the entire universe, or at least my entire universe, within their blue depths. The moments I held her were moments suspended in time. Pure, uncomplicated joy. I remembered the first time they brought her here, the awkward ceremony of handing her over, my arms aching with a need I hadn't realized was so profound. It was a different kind of love than loving a child. It was the culmination of watching your child become a parent, the miracle unfolding in a tiny bundle. I had envisioned this for years, daydreamed about it during lonely afternoons. After John passed, imagining the pitter-patter of small feet on these very floors, the echo of childish laughter bouncing off these familiar walls. It was supposed to be the golden chapter, the reward for a lifetime of putting others first, of sacrificing, of holding the family together through thin and thinner. But sometimes, the most beautiful visions are the most brutally shattered. It started subtly, like a hairline crack. You don't notice until the whole pane of glass shatters. Little comments disguised as casual observations. "Oh, Mom, she just ate. She can't be hungry." When Lily fussed, of course. Or we're really trying to stick to a strict nap schedule, you know? Delivered with that tight, polite smile my daughter-in-law Sarah had perfected. A smile that never quite reached her eyes. Always held a hint of something reserved, something judged. I tried to brush them off, attribute it to new parent jitters, the anxiety of wanting to do everything right. I had been a new mother once, hadn't I? I remembered the fear, the exhaustion. I wanted to help, truly help, without interfering. I offered advice only when asked, and even then prefaced it with, "This is just what worked for us, but you do what feels right for you." It seemed that wasn't enough. Every offer of help, every shared memory of raising my son, Daniel, every moment I simply wanted to hold my granddaughter and breathe in the sweet scent of her baby hair, felt like it was being scrutinized, weighed, and found wanting. The house, too, became a point of quiet contention. It was older, yes, filled with my things, my history. Not the sterile minimalist perfection Sarah favored. She'd made comments about it needing updating, about how cluttered it felt. I just smiled and said it was cozy, filled with memories, but her disapproval hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just about decor. It was about her wanting to erase me from the space, to make it neutral, to exert control even here in my sanctuary. I saw it in her eyes, the way she looked at the worn rug, the overflowing bookshelves, the photographs lining the mantelpiece, photos of Daniel growing up, of John and me, of a life lived fully within these walls. It was a life she didn't understand, perhaps didn't respect. And it hurt, a dull ache that settled deep in my bones. I had wanted to welcome her, to make her feel like a daughter. I had tried. Dinners, gifts, offering to help with wedding planning, biting my tongue when her choices weren't what I would have made. I thought we were building something. Silly, naive me. I had mistaken politeness for warmth, calculation for connection. Sarah was beautiful, in a sharp, modern way. Always perfectly put together, her clothes impeccable, her hair styled just so. She was articulate, intelligent, successful in her career. On the surface, she was everything you'd want for your son. She charmed people easily with that bright, brittle smile and the right words. But I saw the glint in her eyes, the micro-expressions that flickered across her face when she thought no one was looking. I saw the way she subtly steered conversations, the way she could twist a situation to her advantage without ever raising her voice. She was a master strategist, and I, it turned out, was ill-equipped for her battlefield. Daniel, my sweet boy, was caught in the middle, though he rarely seemed to realize it. He adored Sarah, saw her through a haze of love, and perhaps a touch of awe at her confidence and drive. He'd always been a gentle soul, easily influenced, wanting to please everyone. He'd listen to me, nod, agree that maybe Sarah was being a little overprotective, but then he'd default to whatever she wanted. His loyalty, I began to see, lay firmly with his wife. And that was how it should be, in theory, but it shouldn't require throwing his mother under the bus, not even in small, quiet ways. He seemed oblivious to the tension that crackled between Sarah and me, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it, hoping it would resolve itself. It wouldn't. Things like this don't just resolve. They fester. They grow like weeds in the carefully tended garden of family relationships, choking out the blooms you tried so hard to cultivate. Lily was the most beautiful bloom, and I felt Sarah saw my love for her as a threat, a competition, a zero-sum game where my gain was her loss. It was absurd, twisted. My love for my grandchild didn't diminish her role as mother. It merely added another layer of protection, of adoration, of support around that precious little life. But Sarah didn't see it that way. She saw control, and she wanted all of it. The air had been thick with unspoken resentments for months, leading up to that day. Each visit felt like navigating a minefield, every interaction carefully calibrated to avoid upsetting the delicate balance Sarah maintained. I'd walk on eggshells in my own home, which felt profoundly wrong, a deep violation of everything these walls stood for. I'd prepare Lily's favorite pureed carrots, only for Sarah to bring her own pre-packaged organic kale mush, explaining, loudly enough for me to hear from the kitchen, how important it was to introduce diverse non-processed flavors early. I'd offer a well-loved soft blanket Dawn had bought for Daniel as a baby, and Sarah would politely but firmly decline, mentioning concerns about allergens and preferring a brand new, hypoallergenic one. Each refusal, each subtle dismissal of my offerings, my experience, my very being as a grandmother, chipped away at my spirit. I started dreading their visits, which felt like a terrible betrayal of my own longing to see Lily. I knew Sarah sensed this, sensed my withdrawal, and perhaps even welcomed it. It gave her more space, more control. She would hold Lily tightly, almost possessively, whenever I was near, keeping her face turned away, her body language a silent barrier. It was like she was saying, "She is mine. You had your turn. My turn?" Was grandparenthood just a turn? Was the deep, aching love I felt for this child, the spiritual connection that transcended words, just a scheduled slot in someone else's life? The thought was a cold, hard stone in my gut. Daniel, bless his oblivious heart, would try to bridge the gap, usually by suggesting we all do something together. "Mom, why don't you come to the park with us?" Or, "Sarah, let's ask Mom over for dinner this week." Sarah would smile that tight smile and have a ready excuse. Lily's nap schedule, a prior engagement. The baby was a little fussy today and needed a quiet afternoon. It was never a direct refusal to me, always framed as what was best for Lily, which of course was irrefutable, because who could argue with what was best for the baby? It was a clever, insidious way to exclude me while appearing to be the hypervigilant, perfect mother. I saw through it, of course, but what could I do? Point it out? That would make me the bitter, jealous mother-in-law, exactly the narrative I suspected Sarah was cultivating. So I kept my peace, swallowed my hurt, and hoped Daniel would eventually see it. He didn't, or couldn't, or wouldn't. That question still haunts me, the uncertainty of my son's perception, his loyalty. Did he truly not see it? Or did he see it and choose her side? That particular doubt is a venom that seeps into the quietest corners of my heart. The tension culminated on a Sunday afternoon. They had come over, a rare visit initiated by Daniel. I suspected, perhaps sensing the growing distance, or maybe just wanting to see me. The atmosphere was already strained. Sarah seemed particularly on edge, fluttering around Lily, adjusting her blanket, checking her temperature, offering her a bottle minutes after she'd finished one. Lily was content, sitting on my lap by the window, gazing outside with that sweet, unblinking focus babies have. Her little hand rested on my chest, a feather-light weight that felt like the most precious thing in the world. I was talking to Daniel about his work, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy while Sarah hovered. She asked if Lily was warm enough, then if she was too warm. She asked if I was holding her correctly, suggesting I support her back more firmly, even though Lily was perfectly comfortable, leaning into me. It was relentless, a barrage of unnecessary comments designed, I now see clearly, to undermine my confidence, to make me feel inept or worse, a threat to the baby's well-being. I kept my voice calm, answering her questions patiently, trying not to let her see how much it was getting to me. But inside, I was shrinking, feeling the familiar prickle of being judged, of being found wanting. This wasn't about Lily's comfort. It was about Sarah asserting dominance, marking her territory, sending a clear message. And then Lily let out a small, happy gurgle and snuggled closer into my embrace. I smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her soft head. It was a quiet, tender moment, one that felt utterly natural and full of love. And that's when Sarah spoke. Her voice was tight, edged with something that was not concern, something sharp and dismissive. "Mom," she said, using that tone that always made my stomach clench, the one that implied she was about to patiently explain something obvious to a slightly dim-witted person. "Maybe you're being a little too clingy with her." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Too clingy. Me. With my granddaughter, the baby I adored, the child who was the flesh and blood of my son, the tiny human who represented the future, the continuation, the hope. Me who had waited years for this role, who had offered nothing but love in a lifetime of quiet support. Too clingy, as if my love was a burden, a smothering weight, something undesirable, even harmful. The blood drained from my face. I felt a cold knot form in my chest, spreading outwards like ice. Daniel shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, finally looking up, his brow furrowed. He seemed to sense the sudden shift in atmosphere, the way the air had just turned frigid, but he didn't say anything. He just looked from Sarah to me, his eyes pleading with me. I thought, not to make a scene. A scene? Was I the one making a scene by simply holding my grandchild? Sarah's face was impassive now, that polite, unreadable smile firmly in place. She didn't look apologetic or even slightly uncomfortable. She looked triumphant, as if she had finally said the quiet part out loud, finally delivered the blow she had been preparing. Too clingy. The phrase echoed in the sudden silence, bouncing off the walls of my home, of my heart. It wasn't just about that moment, that one comment. It was about everything that had come before. Every subtle exclusion, every veiled criticism, every barrier she had placed between me and Lily. It was the summation of her attitude, the core of her resentment. She didn't just think I was too clingy. She thought my presence, my love, my role as grandmother was excessive, an intrusion on her carefully curated life. She wanted me reduced, minimized, kept at a safe, sterile distance, and she had used the harshest possible words, the most hurtful accusation, to achieve it. In that instant, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. It was quiet, internal, like a tired old rope, finally fraying completely. The years of trying to be the good mother-in-law, of biting my tongue, of making allowances, of hoping against hope that she would eventually warm up, that she would see me not as a rival but as an ally, all of it evaporated. In its place was a chilling clarity. She didn't value me. She didn't respect me. She saw me as an obstacle, a nuisance, and my legacy, the future I had hoped to share with my son and his family. the legacy that included this house, everything John and I had worked for. Why would I leave it to someone who felt that way? Someone who could so cruelly dismiss my love, my very being, as too clingy. I looked down at Lily, still nestled in my arms, oblivious to the storm raging within me. Her innocent face was a stark contrast to the ugliness that had just been unleashed. How could someone who claimed to love this child want to deny her the love of her grandmother? It felt perverse, unnatural. I carefully stood up, cradling Lily gently. I walked over to Sarah and Daniel, standing side by side. I held Lily out to Sarah. My hands didn't tremble. My voice when I spoke was low and steady, stripped of all emotion. "Perhaps you're right, Sarah," I said, the irony lost on her. "I'm sure. Perhaps I am. Here." I placed Lily carefully into her arms. Sarah took her, a flicker of surprise on her face, quickly replaced by that bland, victorious smile. Daniel looked confused, relief warring with concern in his eyes. He still didn't speak, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't challenge Sarah's cruel words. And in that silence, in his passive acceptance, I saw everything I needed to see. The betrayal wasn't just Sarah's, it was his too. In his inaction, his silence, he chose his peace over my pain. He chose her comfort over my validation. I watched Sarah hold Lily, already adjusting her grip, fussing with her clothes, turning her face away from me, as if to reinforce the boundary. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were observing the scene from very far away. The love for Lily was still there, a deep, abiding ache, but it was now overlaid with a thick layer of grief and anger. Grief for the relationship I had hoped for, the future I had envisioned. Anger at Sarah for her cruelty, at Daniel for his silence, and perhaps most surprisingly, at myself for allowing this to happen, for not setting boundaries earlier, for expecting too much. I walked away from them, across the living room, the familiar furniture suddenly seeming alien, cold. I sat down again in my armchair, but the comfort was gone. It felt like just a chair, a place to sit while my world rearranged itself around me. Sarah and Daniel stayed for a little while longer. The conversation stilted, forced. Daniel made a few attempts at light-hearted chat, glancing at me nervously, but I offered little in return. My silence wasn't sulking. It was a shield. It was the silence of someone who has just heard a truth they can no longer ignore. Sarah, for her part, seemed determined to act as if nothing had happened, chatting brightly about Lily's milestones, future plans, anything to fill the awkward void. It was a performance, and a chillingly effective one. When they finally gathered their things to leave, Sarah offered a perfunctory, "Thanks for having us," her eyes already scanning the room as if mentally redecorating it. Daniel hugged me awkwardly. "You okay, Mom?" he murmured, his voice low. I just nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. He hesitated for a moment, then followed Sarah out the door. The click of the latch sounded incredibly loud in the sudden stillness. And then, I was alone. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence after a storm, the air heavy with the residue of destruction. I sat there for a long time, the sun dipping lower in the sky, painting the room in hues of orange and purple. Too clingy. The words played on repeat in my mind, each repetition stripping away another layer of the hope I had clung to. They were designed to wound, and they had succeeded. But they had also ignited something else, something cold and hard and resolute. What did I owe Sarah? What did I owe someone who saw me as a burden, someone who wanted to erase me from the landscape of my son's family, someone who thought my love for my grandchild was too much? Nothing. I owed her nothing. And what about Daniel, my son, whom I loved more than life itself? Did he defend me? Did he tell his wife that her words were cruel? That my love for Lily was a gift, not a burden? No. He stood by, silent, choosing the path of least resistance. My son, who owed me everything. in the way children inherently owe their parents the acknowledgement of their sacrifices, the respect for their love. He owed me loyalty, or at least the courage to speak up when I was being hurt, especially by his wife. He had failed that test, and the failure felt monumental. It wasn't just about the comment, it was about the years leading up to it, the foundation of our relationship, which suddenly felt shaky, unreliable. He had allowed his wife to treat me with disrespect, and in doing so had disrespected me himself. My mind, which had been reeling, began to settle, focusing with sharp clarity on the future, on my future, on the house, the tangible representation of my life, my work, my legacy. It was everything John and I had built, brick by brick, memory by memory. It was meant for Daniel. Yes, eventually, and for his family. But what family? The one where I was deemed too clingy? The one where my love was seen as a problem? No, that wasn't the family I envisioned leaving my legacy to. The idea solidified slowly, then with increasing certainty. It was a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of control in a situation where I had felt powerless. Sarah saw my love for Lily as a threat. She saw my role as grandmother as something to be managed, minimized, eventually perhaps eliminated. She saw me, perhaps, as a barrier to what she felt was rightfully hers. Not just Daniel's attention, but everything I represented, including this house, this life. And she felt entitled to it, despite her disdain. But entitlement is not inheritance. Inheritance is a gift. And gifts are given out of love, out of respect, out of a desire to continue a bond. I felt none of that towards Sarah anymore. Only a cold, quiet disappointment. I thought about the will. John and I had made it years ago. A simple document, leaving everything to Daniel. After John passed, I hadn't changed it. It felt right. Daniel was our son, our only child. Of course, everything would go to him. And when he married Sarah, it felt natural, almost automatic, that she would be included, if not directly, then through him. They were a unit now. Her name wasn't explicitly on the will, not initially, but she was his wife, and effectively, half of the recipients of my estate. But things had changed. She had changed things. Her actions, her words, had redrawn the lines of my life, of my relationships, and I needed to acknowledge that, to reflect it in the only tangible way I had left, the will. It wasn't about punishing Sarah, not purely. It was about protecting myself, my peace of mind, and the memory of the life John and I had built. It was about ensuring that my legacy didn't fall into the hands of someone who held me in contempt. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying no more. The decision once made brought a strange sense of calm. It felt powerful, a quiet assertion of my own worth, my own agency. They could take my peace, they could wound my heart, but they couldn't dictate how I chose to leave my mark on the world after I was gone. That was still mine to decide. The days that followed were quiet, punctuated only by the mundane rhythm of my solitary life. I went through the motions, but my mind was constantly working, solidifying the decision, planning the next steps. I felt a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. It was the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose, from realizing that the worst has already happened, that the relationship you cherished has been irrevocably damaged, not by your actions, but by someone else's malice and your son's acquiescence. I thought about calling Daniel, trying to explain how much his wife's words had hurt, how his silence had felt like a second betrayal. But what was the point? He hadn't understood in the moment, and I doubted he would understand now. He would likely defend Sarah, minimize her comment, perhaps even suggest I was overreacting, being, yes, too emotional. That was another one of Sarah's favorite subtle tactics. Framing my feelings as irrational, overblown, a sign of age or loneliness. I wouldn't give her or him the satisfaction of seeing me beg for understanding or validation. I would handle this my way, quietly and decisively. The will? That was the key. It was the most direct way to communicate the gravity of the situation without needing words, words that had failed me so spectacularly in that living room. It would be a consequence they couldn't ignore, a tangible reflection of the broken trust, the fractured relationship. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the principle, about reclaiming my dignity, about refusing to be a doormat, even in death. I called Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, a kind, steady man who had handled John's estate and updated my will after his passing. His voice was calm and reassuring on the phone. I told him I needed to make some significant changes to my will, that it was urgent and highly personal. He scheduled an appointment for the following week. The week felt like an eternity, and a blink of an eye. I spent the days tidying the house, organizing papers, doing mundane tasks that kept my hands busy while my mind processed the seismic shift in my emotional landscape. I looked at photographs of Daniel as a child, smiling, innocent, full of love for his mother. It was hard to reconcile that image with the man who had sat silently while his wife wounded me so deeply. I reminded myself that people change, relationships evolve, and sometimes, painfully, they break. I also looked at photos of Lily, her sweet face a reminder of what was lost, or at least, what was now held at a distance. Would I still see her? Would Sarah restrict access? The thought was agonizing, but I knew that had already begun. Regardless of the will was about me, about my boundaries, not about manipulating access to Lily. That was their cruelty, should they choose it. The day of the appointment with Miss Henderson arrived. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made me feel capable, composed. Walking into his office felt significant, like stepping onto a stage for a pivotal scene. His office was quiet, filled with books and the scent of old paper. He greeted me warmly, his expression shifting to one of gentle concern as he saw the seriousness on my face. I sat across from him and explained, as calmly as I could, the situation. I told him about Lily, about Sarah, about the growing tension, and finally, about the too clingy comment. I watched his face as I spoke, seeing his empathy, his understanding. He didn't interrupt, just listened patiently, occasionally nodding. When I told him my decision, that I wanted to remove any provision that would benefit Sarah, directly or indirectly, through Daniel, and to clearly stipulate how my assets, particularly the house, were to be handled, he simply said, "I understand, this is a difficult decision, but it is your right, and if it brings you peace, then it is the right decision for you." He explained the legal ramifications, ensuring I understood that this was a final act, one that could have significant consequences for my relationship with Daniel. I told him I understood. The relationship was already damaged, perhaps beyond repair. This was simply an acknowledgement of that reality. We went through the details. He explained the implications of leaving assets solely to Daniel versus potentially setting up a trust or even naming alternate beneficiaries. I chose to leave everything to Daniel, but with very specific conditions attached to the house. The house, my home, was not to be sold or used by Sarah in any way. It was to be held for Lily, perhaps in a trust managed by someone I designated, not Daniel or Sarah, until she came of age. If Daniel and Sarah were still together and wanted to live in it with Lily, that would be up to the trustee and depending on their behavior. But the ownership structure would protect it from Sarah's control or any potential future issues if their marriage faltered. It felt like a way to ensure my legacy, my home, ultimately benefited my grandchild, the innocent party in all of this, while circumventing Sarah entirely and putting Daniel in a position where he would have to choose, respect my wishes, and potentially access the assets for Lily's future, or alienate me further by siding with Sarah against the terms. It was a complex mechanism, but Mr. Henderson assured me it was legally sound and would make my intentions crystal clear. The process took time, involved redrafting documents, reviewing clauses, signing papers. Each signature felt like a small, decisive hammer blow, sealing the new reality. It wasn't done out of spite. Not entirely. It was done out of a deep protective love for my granddaughter, a desperate need to ensure that she was provided for, and a cold, hard recognition that her mother was not someone I could trust with my life's work, with the tangible embodiment of my love for my family. It was also an act of self-preservation, My home was my sanctuary, the place where I had felt most myself. The thought of Sarah eventually sweeping through it, discarding my things, imposing her sterile aesthetic, felt like a violation. This way, I was protecting my space, my memories, from her reach. As I signed the final document, a profound sense of peace washed over me, mixed with a deep sadness. I had taken control, yes, but the cost was the potential further fracturing of my relationship with my son. But then, I reasoned, the fracture was already there. I was just acknowledging it, making it visible. It was a bittersweet victory. Empowerment born from pain. Walking out of Mr. Henderson's office felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel. The world outside seemed brighter, sharper. I had done it. The will was changed. The legal framework was in place to ensure that Sarah, the woman who found my love too clingy, would never benefit from my life's work. It was a definitive act, one that couldn't be unsaid or undone with a casual apology, should one ever be offered. Highly unlikely, I suspected. Now came the difficult part. Waiting for them to find out. How would they discover it? Would I tell Daniel? Would Mr. Henderson inform him after my death, as is standard practice? I decided against telling Daniel myself, at least not immediately. There was nothing to gain from a preemptive confrontation. It would only lead to argument, denial, and more pain. Let them find out in time. The consequences would land with more force then. The silence stretched between us over the next few weeks. Daniel called occasionally. Short, stilted conversations. He didn't mention the incident with Sarah, and neither did I. It was the elephant in the room, growing larger and more imposing with each passing day of unspoken resentment. He asked about my health, the house, trivial things. He didn't invite me over, didn't suggest bringing Lily by. The distance was palpable. A chasm opening between us. I knew he was likely pressured by Sarah, or perhaps he was simply too uncomfortable to face the situation, hoping it would somehow smooth itself over. It wouldn't. My anger towards him, while different from my anger towards Sarah, was still a heavy weight. The son I had raised to be kind, to be fair, had failed to be either when it mattered most. He had chosen peace over principle, his wife's comfort over his mother's feelings. That hurt. Lingered. A dull, persistent ache. I missed Lily terribly. The quiet house felt empty without the possibility of her visits, without the anticipation of holding her, hearing her happy sounds. I looked at her photos, arranged carefully on a table near my armchair. Her innocent face was a painful reminder of the joy that had been tainted. Sarah had used Lily as a weapon, and in doing so had weaponized my love for her. It felt deeply unfair to the baby herself. This innocent life caught in the crossfire of adult conflict. I wondered if Sarah understood the magnitude of what she had done, the depth of the wound she had inflicted. Did she care? I suspected not. Her goal, I was increasingly certain, was control, and my genuine uncalculated love for Lily was an unpredictable element she couldn't manage. By framing it as clinginess, she could pathologize it, dismiss it, and create a justification for keeping me away. It was a brilliant, cruel tactic. Time passed. Weeks turned into a month. The silence from their end grew heavier. It was clear they were either deliberately keeping their distance or simply didn't know how to navigate the awkwardness they had created.
I didn't reach out. I had made my move a quiet, internal one for now. The ball was, in a sense, in their court, though they didn't know the game had fundamentally changed.
I started spending more time on myself. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during my single-minded focus on Daniel's family. I took up gardening again, finding solace in the simple, predictable rhythm of nurturing plants. I read books, listened to music, things I hadn't made time for. It was a process of rediscovering myself, the woman who existed independently of being a mother or grandmother. It wasn't easy. There were moments of profound loneliness, moments when the grief for my fractured family felt overwhelming. But beneath the sadness was a new strength, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I had faced betrayal, faced disrespect, and instead of crumbling, I had taken action. I had drawn a boundary, I had asserted my worth. The will wasn't just a legal document. It was a symbol of that assertion. It was me saying my feelings matter. My home matters. My legacy matters. And you cannot treat me with contempt and expect to inherit the fruits of my labor, the embodiment of my life. It felt empowering, yes, but it was an empowerment born of pain. It was the strength of someone who has been pushed to the edge and found within themselves the will to push back, not out of aggression but out of self-preservation. I knew that when they eventually found out about the will, there would be an explosion. Sarah would be furious, her entitlement challenged, her plans disrupted. Daniel, I wasn't sure how Daniel would react. Disappointment? Anger? Would he finally understand the depth of my hurt? Or would he simply see it as a punitive act against his wife, against their future? I braced myself for the fallout. I knew it wouldn't be pleasant, but I was ready. Ready to stand my ground, ready to explain, calmly and clearly, why I had done what I had done, ready to reiterate the words that had driven me to this point, too clingy, and ready to articulate how those words, and his silence, had cost them more than just an inheritance. They had cost them the relationship I had fought so hard to preserve. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't a dramatic doorstep scene like in the movies. It was more insidious, more typical of Sarah's style. It started with a phone call from Daniel, his voice tight and strained. He asked if I had recently made any changes to my will. His tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my voice steady. Yes, Daniel, I said. I did. A pause stretched between us, thick with unspoken tension. Why? He finally asked, the single word loaded with hurt and confusion. Because, I replied, choosing my words carefully. I needed to ensure my wishes were respected, and that my assets would go where I intended them to go, given recent circumstances. Recent circumstances? He repeated, his voice rising slightly. What are you talking about, Mom? Is this about Sarah?
He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable saying her name in this context. It's about how I've been treated, I said, my voice gaining a quiet firmness. It's about disrespect.
It's about feeling undervalued and unwanted in my own son's life, in my granddaughter's life. He sputtered, clearly unprepared for my directness. Undervalued? Unwanted? Mom, that's not fair. We love you. Do you? I challenged gently, the pain in my voice unmistakable. Love doesn't dismiss someone's feelings. Love doesn't stay silent when someone they claim to love is being hurt. Love doesn't call a grandmother's affection for her grandchild too clingy. The last phrase landed like a stone. He was silent for a long moment. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. Then Sarah's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the line. She must have been listening, perhaps even coaching him. What does that have to do with your will, Marjorie? She demanded, dropping the pretense of politeness. Are you really punishing Daniel because of something I said? It's not something you said, Sarah, I corrected, my voice hardening. It was a cruel, calculated remark that summarized months of your efforts to exclude me, to undermine me, to make me feel unwelcome. And yes, it has everything to do with my will. My will is a reflection of my life, my values, and my relationships. Given how you feel about me, given how you've treated me, why on earth would I want you to benefit from my life's work? Benefit? She scoffed, her voice laced with incredulity, masking, I suspected, genuine shock and anger. We don't need your money. Daniel has a good job. I have a good job. We're not relying on your inheritance. Perhaps not. I conceded, but you certainly seemed comfortable with the idea of it. And entitlement, Sarah, is a dangerous thing. I am ensuring that what I built with John goes to the people who value it, and who value me. And you, unfortunately, have shown that you do neither. This is unbelievable, she hissed. You're cutting off your own son. I am not cutting off Daniel, I stated clearly. I am setting conditions on my assets based on the reality of our current relationship. Daniel is still the primary beneficiary, with specific provisions for Lily in the house that protect it from exactly this kind of outcome. I didn't elaborate on the specifics of the trust or the conditions on the house. Let them wonder. Let them worry. Let them understand that my decision was not capricious, but deliberate and legally sound. The silence on the other end was now a tangible force. Sarah was likely realizing the extent of the changes, the implications for her own influence and perceived future security. Daniel was probably caught between his wife's fury and the dawning realization that his inaction had led to this significant consequence. "How could you do this, Mom?" Daniel's voice was quiet again, but filled with a different kind of pain now, one of loss. "How could you be so vindictive?" "Vindictive?" I repeated, the word stinging. "Is that what you call standing up for myself? Is that what you call refusing to be treated with contempt?" "Daniel, I waited for you to say something. I waited for you to acknowledge how she treated me. Your silence spoke volumes. This is not vindictiveness, Daniel. This is consequence. This is the natural outcome of disrespecting someone who has loved you unconditionally your entire life." "But Lily?" he stammered, grasping for something. "What about Lily?" "Lily is precisely why I made these changes," I said, my voice softening slightly when I spoke of my granddaughter. "I want to ensure her future is secure, that she is cared for, that my home, which holds so many memories, can be a stable place for her, regardless of what happens in your marriage or how you choose to treat me. My love for Lily is separate from your mother's issues, Daniel. It is pure and unconditional, and I have made provisions to protect her interest above all else." This was a half-truth, or perhaps a carefully worded truth. Yes, I wanted to protect Lily, but the structure I'd put in place was undeniably a direct response to Sarah and Daniel's actions, a way to ensure Sarah couldn't easily access or control the assets I intended for Lily's future. It was a way to use my legacy as a lever, a final assertion of power in a dynamic where I had been made to feel powerless. Sarah interjected again, her voice laced with fury. "You're just trying to control us, Marjorie. You always have. This is sick." "If setting boundaries, Sarah, is control in your world," I responded, my voice regaining its steel edge, "then perhaps you should examine why you feel so threatened by a woman simply standing up for herself. I am not trying to control you. I am removing myself and my assets from your control. There's a difference." "This changes everything," Daniel said, his voice defeated. "Yes, Daniel," I agreed, a profound sadness washing over me. "It does, because you allowed it to." The line went dead. The silence after the phone call was deafening. I held the receiver for a moment, the plastic warm against my ear, before slowly replacing it in its cradle. My hand trembled slightly, but my core felt solid. It was over. The conversation I had dreaded, and yet, in a strange way, anticipated, had happened. They knew. The truth was out, and the predictable storm of anger and accusation had broken. Sarah's fury was exactly what I had expected. The shock of entitlement denied. The swift pivot from superficial charm to open hostility. It was a validation in a twisted way of everything I had suspected about her character. She wasn't upset about my feelings. She was upset about the financial implications, the loss of control over a future inheritance she had likely already mentally spent. Her mask had fallen, revealing the calculating face beneath. Daniel's reaction, though painful, was also revealing. His immediate accusation of vindictiveness, his failure to truly grapple with the reasons behind my actions, showed me just how deep his enmeshment with Sarah was, how effectively she had framed the narrative within their marriage. He saw me as the aggressor, the unreasonable one, the mother who was punishing her son rather than the person who had been pushed to a breaking point. His concern for Lily, while perhaps genuine, also felt like a last-ditch effort to appeal to my emotions, to derail the conversation from the core issue of his and Sarah's disrespect. It was a desperate move, and it solidified my understanding of his inability or unwillingness to stand up to his wife, even when it meant sacrificing his relationship with me. There was no path back to the way things were. The chasm had widened, perhaps irreversibly. I had chosen my dignity, my peace of mind, and the protection of my legacy for Lily over the pretense of a harmonious family unit that didn't exist. It was a high price to pay. The days that followed were heavy with the weight of the unresolved conflict. I didn't hear from them again. The silence this time felt different, not awkward or uncertain, but deliberate, punitive. They were likely digesting the news, perhaps consulting their own lawyer, calculating their next move. I knew there might be legal challenges, attempts to contest the will, especially the provisions regarding the house, but I was prepared for that. Mr. Henderson had assured me the changes were well documented and reflected my clear intent. Their only real argument would be to claim I was not of sound mind, which was patently untrue. I was never more clear-headed than when I made that decision. The quiet strength I had found within myself grew. I wasn't consumed by anger anymore, but by a calm resolve. I had done what I felt was necessary to protect myself and to send a clear message. The message was not just about money or property. It was about respect. It was about the fundamental truth that you cannot treat people poorly and expect them to reward you for it. You cannot dismiss someone's love as too clingy and expect them to leave you their entire life's accumulation. It was a harsh lesson, but one I felt compelled to teach, not just for my own sake, but perhaps, in a long-term indirect way, for Lily's. What kind of example would it set for her if I allowed myself to be walked over? If I taught her that boundaries didn't matter, that disrespect was acceptable if it came from family? No, my action, though painful, was also an act of teaching, of demonstrating that a woman, even an older woman who might seem vulnerable, has the right to stand up for herself, to protect her space, her legacy, her emotional well-being. The house, which had been a source of subtle conflict, now felt more profoundly mine than ever before. It wasn't just walls and a roof, it was a testament to a life lived, to hard work, to love, to resilience. The thought of Sarah's sterile touch, her disdainful gaze sweeping over my treasured possessions, no longer held power over me. It was protected now, a sanctuary not just for me, but eventually, hopefully, for Lily, a place where she could one day understand a different kind of life, one built on genuine connection, not superficial performance. I spent more time in the garden, pruning the roses John had planted years ago, feeling the earth in my hands, connecting with the tangible, living world outside the emotional turmoil. The act of tending the plants, ensuring they had the right conditions to thrive, felt like a metaphor for my own life. I was tending to myself, ensuring I had the right conditions to thrive, even in the face of loss and betrayal. It wasn't the future I had planned. It was lonelier, certainly. The vision of noisy family Christmases, of grandchildren's birthdays, celebrated in this living room, of lazy summer afternoons, watching Lily play in the garden. That vision had fractured. It hurt, a deep abiding sorrow for what might have been. But the future that had seemed possible, the one where I was a marginalized figure in my own home, constantly battling for a place in my granddaughter's life, that future was even bleaker. I had avoided that. I had chosen a different path, one of quiet independence, of reclaiming my own narrative. It was a bittersweet freedom, free from the tension, the constant judgment, the subtle cruelty, but also free from the easy, expected joys of grandparenthood, the ones I had craved for so long. The house remained my sanctuary, a quiet testament to the life I had built. I continued my routines, finding comfort in their predictability. The seasons changed. The leaves turned from green to gold and fell, covering the garden in a soft, decaying blanket. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke. Christmas came and went, a quiet affair spent with a friend. No cards from Daniel and Sarah, no calls. The silence was absolute. It confirmed what I already knew. They had made their choice. The inheritance, the symbolic representation of my value to them, had trampled any remaining filial or familial connection. It was a stark, painful confirmation. It validated my decision completely, leaving my assets to them, as things stood, would have felt like a final act of self-annihilation, an endorsement of their disrespect. By changing the will, I had refused to be erased. I had asserted my existence, my worth, my boundaries. The house felt more like mine than ever. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, looking at the photographs. Each object held a memory, a story. This wasn't just property, it was the physical manifestation of my life, of the love John and I shared, of the hopes we had for our future, for Daniel's future. It was a legacy built on hard work and sacrifice, not something to be casually dismissed or greedily anticipated by someone who held me in contempt. The provisions in the will for Lily, placing the house in trust for her future use and benefit, felt like the right decision. It bypassed Sarah's control, ensuring that my home, my legacy, would eventually pass to the innocent party, the one person in that family unit for whom my love was pure and uncomplicated, and who I hoped would one day understand. It was a way to connect with her across time, a way to provide for her future, and a way to ensure that my memory was preserved, not in sterile perfection, but in the warm, cluttered reality of the home I loved. It was also, I admitted to myself, a subtle challenge to Daniel and Sarah. If they wanted Lily to benefit from the house, they would eventually have to engage with the trust, with the conditions, with the reality that I had placed her future security outside of their direct control. Because I didn't trust them, it forced a level of accountability, a recognition that their actions had consequences that extended beyond just hurting my feelings. It was a quiet inversion of the power dynamic. They had wielded their power through exclusion and disrespect. I had wielded mine through legal structure and the assertion of my financial autonomy. It wasn't a kind of power I had ever wanted, born from pain and disappointment. But it was power nonetheless. The power to protect myself, to define my legacy, to refuse to be invisible. I didn't feel vindictive. Not anymore. The initial shock and hurt had subsided, replaced by a quiet certainty. This was not revenge. It was consequence. It was the natural outcome of a relationship broken by a lack of respect and empathy. It was bittersweet. I grieved the loss of my son's easy affection, the simple pleasure of being a doting grandmother without complication. But I no longer felt the corrosive tension, the constant ache of being undervalued. I had traded one kind of pain for another, perhaps less acute but more enduring. Yet there was also a sense of peace, a deep, settled calm that came from having faced the truth and acted upon it. I had stood up for myself. I had honored my feelings. I had protected my home and my legacy. The house was silent. Yes, but it was my silence, not a silence imposed upon me. It was filled not with tension but with my own thoughts, my own memories, my own quiet strength. The future was uncertain. I didn't know if I would ever see Lily again, if Daniel would ever truly understand, but I knew I had done what was right for me. I had taken the too clingy comment, the cruel dismissal of my love, and transformed it from a source of shame and hurt into the catalyst for my own empowerment. I had been pushed, and I had pushed back, not with aggression but with the quiet, unyielding force of self-respect. Spring arrived, painting the garden in vibrant colors. The roses bloomed, their fragrance filling the air. I spent hours outside, tending to them, feeling a connection to the earth, to the cycles of nature, to the enduring beauty of life, despite its hardships. I felt a sense of renewal within myself as well. The bitterness that had threatened to consume me after the confrontation had gradually faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. This was my life now. It wasn't the picture-perfect image I had once held, but it was real, and it was mine. I thought about Lily, about her growing up, about the possibility that she might one day visit this house, read the stories etched into its walls, feel the love that permeated its very foundations. The thought brought a pang of sadness for the years I might miss, but also a glimmer of hope for a future connection, one that bypassed the current conflict. Perhaps when she was older she would seek me out, curious about the grandmother she barely knew. Perhaps Daniel, seeing the consequences of his choices over time, would eventually understand. Perhaps, or perhaps not. I had learned not to cling to unrealistic hopes. My focus was on the present, on living my life with dignity and purpose, on finding joy in the small things. I had faced a profound betrayal, not just from my daughter-in-law, but from my son's inaction. I had felt the sting of being deemed too much, of having my love pathologized and dismissed, but I had not let it destroy me. Instead, I had channeled that pain into action, into reclaiming my autonomy, into ensuring that my legacy reflected the truth of my relationships. The will was a stark reflection of that truth. It wasn't a weapon forged in malice, but a shield constructed from necessity. It protected my home, my financial security, and perhaps most importantly, my sense of self-worth. It was a tangible declaration that my life, my feelings, and my contributions mattered. I had been quietly strong for years, holding the family together, making sacrifices, biting my tongue. The too clingy comment had been the moment that quiet strength became overt. It was the spark that ignited the dormant fire within me, the fire of self-preservation and empowerment. The path ahead wasn't clearly defined. There would likely be more challenges, more difficult conversations, perhaps even legal battles. But I faced them with a quiet confidence. I had done the right thing for me. I had honored my own worth. And in doing so, I had found a different kind of peace. A peace born not from the absence of conflict, but from the knowledge that I had faced it head-on and emerged, though scarred, fundamentally intact. The house stood silent in the spring sun, a solid, enduring presence. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, of a life lived fully and authentically, of a woman who had refused to be silenced or dismissed. And as I stood on the porch, breathing in the scent of the blooming roses, I knew that my story was not one of defeat, but of quiet, hard-won triumph. I had been pushed to the edge, and I had found within myself the strength not just to survive, but to prevail on my own terms. The summer arrived, bringing with it long, languid days. I spent much of my time in the garden, tending to the plants, watching the bees flit among the flowers. The physical labor was grounding, a welcome distraction from the emotional residue of the past year. I received a formal letter from a lawyer representing Daniel and Sarah. It was couched in polite, legalistic language, requesting clarification on the terms of my updated will, particularly regarding the house and the trust established for Lily. It mentioned their concern for Lily's future and their desire to understand the full scope of the provisions. There was no apology, no softening of their stance, just a cold, calculated inquiry into the implications of my decision. It confirmed once again that their primary concern was the material aspect, the inheritance they felt entitled to, not the fractured relationship or the pain they had caused. I forwarded the letter to Mr. Henderson, who handled it with his usual calm competence. He assured me that the will and the trust were legally sound and that their inquiries were standard procedure, a way for them to assess their options, potentially paving the way for a challenge. I felt a surge of weariness at the prospect of legal battles, but also a quiet resolve. I would not back down. I had made these decisions based on principle and self-preservation, and I would defend them. There was a brief, strained phone call from Daniel a few weeks later. He didn't mention the lawyer's letter directly, but his questions circled around the same topic: my assets, my plans, the future. He sounded frustrated, perhaps sensing that his attempts to influence me were futile. He said something about Sarah being upset about her, feeling that I was being unfair, that I was holding the will over their heads. The irony was not lost on me. I was holding the will over their heads? They were the ones who had created the situation that necessitated the changes in the first place. Daniel, I said, my voice tired but firm, this is not about fairness, it's about consequences. Your wife's actions and your silence led to this. My will reflects the reality of our relationship. If you want things to be different, then perhaps you and Sarah need to reflect on how you've treated me. He didn't respond directly, just muttered something about things being complicated. Complicated? Yes, they were. But the complication had been introduced by them, by their choices, by their disrespect. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving me feeling drained, but resolute. It reinforced my conviction that my decision was necessary. They still didn't understand the depth of the hurt, the significance of the too clingy comment as the catalyst for a complete reevaluation of my place in their life. They saw it purely through the lens of inheritance, of financial loss, of power denied. They couldn't see the emotional landscape, the terrain of love, betrayal, and resilience that had led me to this point. And perhaps they never would. That was a painful realization. The acceptance that my son might never truly understand his mother's heart, might never see her as a complex individual with feelings and boundaries, rather than just a figure in his life whose primary purpose was to provide unconditional support and eventually an inheritance. It was a loss, a profound one, but it was a loss I had already begun to mourn. The peace I felt was not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of acceptance. I had accepted that the relationship I had hoped for with Daniel and Sarah, the easy, loving connection that included Lily, might never materialize. I had accepted that my actions had consequences, including potential alienation. But I had also accepted my own right to self-respect, my own right to draw a line, my own right to protect what was mine. That acceptance was empowering. It allowed me to move forward, to focus on my own life, to find meaning and joy outside of their approval or inclusion. The house stood, strong and silent, a symbol of that strength. It was a place of memories, yes, but also a place of the present, of my life now, lived on my own terms. It was the physical embodiment of my resilience, of my refusal to be diminished by disrespect. And in its quiet solidity, I found a deep and abiding sense of peace. The fall brought a familiar coolness to the air. The leaves on the trees around the house began their slow transformation, a riot of color before the inevitable stripping bareness of winter. It felt fitting, a reflection of the changes in my own life. The vibrant colors of hope and expectation had faded, leaving behind a starker, perhaps more honest landscape. There had been no further legal action from Daniel and Sarah, but the tension remained, a silent weight between us. Occasional brief, awkward phone calls were the only contact, strained conversations where we carefully skirted around the edges of the real issues. They didn't ask to visit. I didn't offer. Lily's birthday passed without me. I sent a card and a small gift, a carefully chosen children's book, but received no acknowledgement. It hurt, a sharp, familiar pang, but it didn't break me. I had anticipated this level of exclusion, and I had fortified myself against it. My friend, Eleanor, a widow like me, was a source of immense support. We talked for hours, sharing our experiences of loss, of navigating the complexities of family relationships in later life. She understood the unique pain of feeling undervalued by your own children, of the shifting dynamics that occur when they build their own lives, their own families. She reminded me that my worth wasn't defined by my relationship with Daniel and Sarah, that I had a full and meaningful life independently of them. Her words were a balm to my soul. I continued to find solace in the garden, in my books, in the simple routines of my day. I visited art galleries, attended lectures, things I had put off for years. I was rediscovering the woman I was before I was solely defined by motherhood and wifehood. It was a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming my identity. Piece by piece, the house, my constant companion through this journey, felt less like a static structure filled with the past and more like a dynamic space where my present life unfolded. I rearranged furniture, hung new artwork, little changes that reflected my evolving sense of self. It was an assertion of my continued existence, a declaration that I was still here, still growing, still living fully. The legal provisions in the will felt less like a punitive measure, and more like a protective embrace. It was a way of ensuring that the tangible results of my life's work would not be squandered or controlled by those who had shown a lack of respect for the journey that had created them. It was a way of honoring my past while also providing for a potential future connection with Lily, a connection that bypassed the current strained dynamics. I accepted that my relationship with Daniel might never heal completely. The silence, the lack of understanding, the pain of his acquiescence to Sarah's treatment of me had created a wound that might not ever fully close. It was a source of deep sadness, a quiet grief that I carried with me. But it was no longer a source of debilitating anxiety or all-consuming anger. I had processed it, accepted it, and built a life around it. The too clingy comment, the spark that ignited this fire, had ultimately led me to a place of unexpected strength and clarity. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my relationships, about my own expectations, and about the need to prioritize my own well-being. It had been a painful catalyst, but a necessary one. As winter approached, bringing shorter days and colder temperatures, I felt a sense of quiet preparedness. The house was warm and welcoming. I was surrounded by my books, my memories, the tangible evidence of a life well lived. I had faced the storm, and I had weathered it. I had lost something precious. Yes, the easy, uncomplicated warmth of family connection I had always envisioned, but I had gained something invaluable, a profound sense of self-worth, the strength to stand alone, and the peace that comes from knowing you have honored yourself, even when others fail to honor you. The legacy I was leaving was not just financial. It was a legacy of resilience, of quiet strength, of the power of a woman who, when pushed, refused to break. Winter settled over the house, a quiet blanket of white outside my windows. The garden was dormant, resting, gathering strength for the spring to come. It felt like a reflection of my own state, a period of rest and quiet introspection after the storm. The holidays passed with the same silence as before. No calls, no visits, not even a card. It hurt, a deep familiar ache, but it was no longer a shock. I had come to terms with the distance. The estrangement, it was the consequence of choices made, not just mine, but theirs. My decision to change the will wasn't about forcing reconciliation. It was about acknowledging the reality of the broken relationship and ensuring my legacy was handled according to my values, not their expectations or perceived entitlement. The house was warm, filled with the scent of beeswax polish and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It felt like a living entity, a repository of memories, a witness to my resilience. The legal documents, securely stored, were a silent testament to my resolve. They represented the boundary I had drawn, the line I had refused to allow them to cross. I thought about Lily often, wondering about her, imagining her growing up. Would she ever know this house? Would she ever understand the grandmother who loved her fiercely, but was kept at a distance? The provisions in the will felt like a bridge across the chasm, a way to connect with her in the future, a way to ensure she was cared for and that my home, filled with history and love, could be a part of her life. It was a long-term hope, a seed planted in the barren ground of the present. I continued to live my life, filling my days with activities that brought me peace and purpose. I volunteered at the local library, finding joy in connecting with people who shared my love for books. I took up painting, discovering a hidden talent for capturing the quiet beauty of the world around me. I was building a new life, one that was rich and fulfilling on its own terms, not dependent on the approval or inclusion of others. The pain of the too clingy comment, the phrase that had so deeply wounded me, had transformed. It was no longer a raw wound, but a scar, a reminder of where I'd been and how far I had come. It was a symbol of the moment I chose to stop being defined by others' perceptions and start defining myself. The empowerment I felt was quiet, but profound. It wasn't about shouting from the rooftops or seeking external validation. It was an internal knowing, a deep-seated confidence in my own judgment, my own strength. I had faced a difficult situation, one that many might have simply endured in silence, preserving the peace at the cost of their own well-being. But I had chosen a different path, I had chosen to speak, not with angry words, but with decisive action. I had used the tools available to me, the legal framework of a will, the assertion of my autonomy over my own assets, to reclaim my power and redefine my relationships. The house, standing strong against the winter winds, was a symbol of that resilience. It was a monument to a life lived fully, to love lost and found, to challenges faced and overcome. It was my legacy, a legacy of strength, independence, and the quiet power of a woman who dared to draw a line and stand her ground. The future remained uncertain, but I faced it not with fear but with a quiet determination. I had found my footing in the aftermath of the storm, and I was ready for whatever came next. My story was not just about a will, it was about a woman finding her voice, reclaiming her worth, and building a life of purpose on her own terms, even in the face of profound familial betrayal. It was a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the ability to find light in the darkness and to bloom resiliently, even after being dismissed as too clingy. The silence from Daniel and Sarah stretched into the new year. Spring arrived again, a promise of renewal in the burst of green outside my windows. I continued my life, a life that felt increasingly whole and complete. The pain hadn't vanished entirely, but it had softened, becoming a dull ache rather than a sharp wound. I thought of Lily, growing, changing, a little person I barely knew. The house in my mind became more and more her future sanctuary, a place of stability and history in what might be an unpredictable world for her. The legal structure was in place, solid and unyielding, ensuring that my legacy would serve her, not her mother's entitlement. I had acted not out of anger, but out of a fierce, protective love for my granddaughter and a deep-seated need for self-preservation. The too clingy comment had been a cruel trigger. Yes, but the ensuing action was about far more than a single insult. It was about a lifetime of navigating complex family dynamics, of feeling undervalued, and finally, after years of quiet endurance, choosing to assert my own worth. I had given up the hope of a perfect, harmonious family picture, the one I had carried in my heart for so long. It was a painful letting go, but in its place, I had found a different kind of peace, a peace rooted in authenticity and self-respect. I was no longer performing a role, trying to fit into someone else's mold of what a mother-in-law or grandmother should be. I was simply being myself, a woman who had lived, loved, and learned the most important relationship to nurture is the one with yourself. The house, filled with my presence, my memories, my quiet strength, was the embodiment of this journey. It stood as a silent witness to the betrayal, the pain, and the ultimate reclamation of self. It was my sanctuary, my legacy, my quiet triumph. The path ahead was mine alone to walk, perhaps with occasional company, but independent and self-reliant. The bittersweet taste of freedom lingered, the freedom from tension and judgment, but also the freedom from the easy warmth of unconditional family connection. It was a trade-off, a consequence, but it was a choice I had made, and I stood by it, firm and resolute. The quiet strength that had been brewing beneath the surface for years had finally emerged, transforming me from someone who felt betrayed and undervalued into a woman empowered by her own truth, her own boundaries, her own unbreakable spirit. My DL's cruel words had inadvertently given me the courage to claim my own life, my own home, my own legacy, and for that, in a strange, ironic way, I was profoundly, quietly grateful. The years that followed brought a different kind of rhythm to my life. The house remained my steadfast companion, filled with the quiet hum of my solitary existence and the echoes of memories. There were no dramatic confrontations, no attempts at reconciliation. The silence from Daniel and Sarah was absolute, a clear, painful line drawn in the sand. It confirmed the finality of the break, the true cost of their actions, and my response. There were moments, particularly during holidays or quiet evenings, when the ache of missing Daniel, of not knowing Lily, was almost unbearable. I saw photos occasionally, shared inadvertently by mutual acquaintances on social media, Lily growing taller, losing teeth, smiling that bright, innocent smile that still held the power to twist my heart. She was thriving. And for that, I was grateful. But I was not a part of her life. Not in the way I had envisioned. Not in the way my own grandmother had been a part of mine. The house, however, held a different kind of connection to her. I thought of the trust, the legal framework that ensured this place, this repository of my life, would one day be hers, protected from the hands of those who had deemed my love too clingy. It was my silent promise to her, a message across the years that I had loved her fiercely, that I had fought for her future, and that this home was a tangible expression of that enduring love. I continued to live my life fully, finding purpose and joy in my volunteer work, my painting, my friendships. The woman who had felt betrayed and undervalued had blossomed into someone resilient, independent, and quietly confident. The too clingy comment, the catalyst for this transformation, no longer held power over me as an insult. It had become a reminder of the moment I chose myself, the moment I realized that true strength wasn't about holding on tighter, but about knowing when to let go, when to protect your own space, your own heart. The house, my sanctuary, stood as a testament to this journey. It was more than just property. It was a symbol of resilience, a monument to the power of a woman who refused to be diminished by disrespect. It was the embodiment of my legacy, not just financial, but a legacy of quiet strength, of boundaries set, of a life lived authentically, on my own terms, right to the very end. And in that quiet strength, in that unwavering autonomy, I found a peace that surpassed any familial warmth I had lost.